All right. Ready to see the world in a whole new light? Or I guess I should say spectrum. We're diving deep into Flutter gradients today. And, you sent in a fascinating tutorial. I'm excited to explore this, not just from, a coding perspective, but also how gradients, they influence us, even if you've never written a single line of code.
You're absolutely right. Gradients are everywhere. I mean, you think about it, from app designs to natural landscapes. It's incredible. Understanding their power really does give you a new lens for viewing design,
Mm.
digital design,
hmm
and beyond.
So this tutorial we're going deep on today doesn't just list the types of gradients. It goes into best practices, achieving that minimalist look, and stuff that we can all apply to projects, whether it's coding, graphic design, or even something as simple as just picking colors for your living room. But let's start simple. What are gradients, really?
Imagine a sunset. You know the way the sky just seamlessly transitions from those fiery oranges to cool purples? That's a gradient in action. It's basically just a gradual blend between two or more colors. It's not just about aesthetics.
Wait, hold on. Not just aesthetics. I thought that was the whole point.
Well, think about Spotify for a second. You know that vibrant green. You see it. You instantly recognize it. Gradients, even subtle ones, they guide our attention. They create visual hierarchy. And yes, they play a huge role in branding. Really, they're powerful tools for shaping user experience.
Okay, I'm starting to see the depth here. I know the Spotify green, yeah, but I never stopped to think about how it's probably subtly graded within their app, and it's probably drawing my eye to certain buttons or features.
Exactly. Now, this tutorial breaks down gradients into three main types: linear, radial, and sweep. Okay, so first, think of a linear gradient just like that sunset we were talking about. The color progressing along a straight line.
So a radial gradient would be like a spotlight on a stage, that concentrated burst of light fading outwards.
Perfect analogy. It expands outward from a central point, creating this sense of focus and depth. Imagine using that in a website designed to highlight a key product image or something.
And sweep gradients. Those sound a bit more abstract.
Think of a rainbow wheel. A sweep of colors rotating around a central point. While they're less common, they can create some stunning artistic effects, especially in things like illustrations or animations.
No, something that really intrigued me in this tutorial was this whole discussion on minimalism and gradients. Feels counterintuitive, right? Almost like they
Yeah.
should clash. But the source is saying they don't have to be opposites.
Right, and this is where understanding the nuances of gradients really comes into play. Minimalism isn't about the absence of elements, it's about intentionality. You can absolutely have a visually rich design that's still minimalist by using subtle gradients.
They use the example of a material design 3 button. Could you paint a picture for our listener of how that looks, even if they're not a coder?
Imagine a button with a gentle color transition, almost like just a hint of depth, rather than a loud contrasting gradient. It'll use a limited color palette, with shades of a single color kind of blending seamlessly. It's elegant, clean, and very in right now.
I'm picturing those sleek, modern websites where everything is super clean and uncluttered, but still visually engaging. So gradients are kind of a secret weapon for that minimalist aesthetic.
Absolutely. And here's the key takeaway. These principles apply beyond apps. I mean, think about website banners, presentation slides, even something as simple as choosing paint colors for a room.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. It's like knowing these gradient types and how they're used subtly. It makes you a better designer, period, not just a better app developer.
Precisely. And the tutorial dives into some best practices that are universal, like choosing the right color palettes, ensuring contrast for readability, and considering the direction of the gradient to influence how the eye moves across the design.
Okay, we're about to enter a rabbit hole. I can feel it. You mentioned earlier that the listener specifically flagged the FAQ section of this tutorial. And just glancing at it, I see questions about animating gradients, applying them to text, stuff that sounds incredibly complex, but also incredibly cool.
Yeah. It is a bit of a rabbit hole, yeah. But that's where the real fun begins. Don't worry, we'll unpack those seemingly complex concepts in a way that's easy to understand and even more exciting to imagine.
This is why I love these deep dives. We go from 0 to 60 on a topic. And I guarantee you, by the end of this, you'll be seeing gradients everywhere you look. But for now, we'll leave you with that image of a subtly graded Spotify button. Just a taste of what's to come.
One of the most valuable things I think this tutorial really emphasizes is how to use gradients effectively. It's so easy to get carried away and just end up with a design that's visually overwhelming.
Right, right. We've all seen those websites, it's like a rainbow explosion just threw up all over the page. Not exactly the minimalist vibe we were talking about before.
Exactly. So the tutorial really stresses that in minimalist design, gradients are best used strategically, almost like accents. They can add that depth, that visual interest, without screaming for attention.
So instead of having like a blinding rainbow gradient on every button, you might use a subtle gradient to make a card element pop.
Hmm.
Or like gently guide the user's eye toward a buy now button or something.
Precisely. It's about enhancing the user experience, not distracting from it. And the tutorial gives some really practical tips on actually achieving this kind of subtle magic with gradients.
Okay, spill the secrets. What are these tips?
Well, first off, they talk about the importance of smooth transitions. If you have like harsh, abrupt color changes, it can be really jarring. Imagine listening to a song with sudden, unexpected shifts in tone. It wouldn't be very pleasant.
Yeah, I'd probably turn that song off pretty quick. You want the visual experience to be smooth and harmonious.
Exactly. So you opt for gradients with gradual, almost imperceptible shifts in hue. And then there's the whole color palette itself. Sticking to a limited number of colors, often within a similar tonal range, reinforces that minimalist aesthetic.
So think pastels, muted tones, subtle variations of a single color, creating a sense of visual calm, not a chaotic explosion of color.
You got it. And of course, never forget about contrast and readability. Like a gorgeous gradient is useless if the user can't read the text on top of it.
That's a really good point. It's so easy to get caught up in the aesthetics and forget about the practical side of things.
Right, and that's where tools for analyzing contrast come in handy. There are online tools and plugins and stuff that can help you make sure your text is legible against whatever gradient you've chosen. Accessibility matters.
The tutorial even dives into the direction of the gradient, so it's not just about the colors, but how they actually flow across the screen.
Yeah, it's interesting. The direction can actually subtly influence perception. So for example, vertical gradients can create a sense of height or elongation. Like picture a website hero section with a vertical gradient, making it feel taller and more expansive.
While horizontal gradients might make an element feel wider, more grounded. It's almost like subliminal messaging with color.
Exactly. And then there's the interplay between gradients and shadows. We're not just dealing with flat colors here. We're trying to create depth and dimension.
Like how a subtle drop shadow can make a button with a gradient seem to lift off the screen. Give it that kind of three-dimensional look.
You got it. It's all about those subtle touches that elevate the design without making it feel overly complicated or busy.
But I guess the main takeaway here is that there's no like one-size-fits-all formula for using gradients.
Absolutely not. The tutorial really encourages experimentation. Play around with different types, color combinations, directions, settings. See what works best for your specific project.
It's like any art form. Learning the basic techniques is essential, but ultimately it's about finding your own style and expressing yourself creatively.
That's what makes design so exciting, right? The endless possibilities. But let's get a little more specific. So the tutorial highlights some examples of gradients in action.
Perfect. I always love to see how the theory actually translates into real-world designs.
One example they focus on is Material Design 3, which is Google's design language. It's known for its very clean, modern aesthetic, and gradients actually play a key role.
Now, material design is all about minimalism, right? So how do they actually use gradients without going overboard?
Well, they use them subtly, often to create those gentle transitions, or to add just a hint of depth to certain elements. For example, they describe an elevated button, which is like a standard button in Flutter, that uses a very subtle linear gradient.
So instead of a solid color, it has this soft blend from one shade of blue to a slightly darker shade, giving it that touch of dimension without being too flashy.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how gradients can be both stylish and functional, enhancing the design without overwhelming it.
It's probably something that most users wouldn't even consciously notice, but it contributes to that overall feeling of polish and sophistication. Subtle yet impactful.
Right. It's about creating those subconscious cues that elevate the user experience. They also highlight the use of gradients in AppBars, which is, the header section at the top of an app screen.
So how do gradients work in that context?
They're often used to give the app bar a sense of depth and kind of help it stand out from the rest of the screen. Again, not a bold, attention-grabbing effect, but just a subtle way to create a more refined, layered visual experience.
It's fascinating how something as simple as a gradient can have such a profound impact on the overall feel of a design.
It really is.
Yeah.
And these are just a couple of examples from the tutorial. The possibilities are truly endless. But remember, we still haven't tackled those juicy questions from the FAQ section about animating gradients and applying them to text.
Oh, yeah, that's where we left off, wasn't it? I'm practically bursting with curiosity.
I know, right? Animating gradients is where things get really interesting. It's like taking everything we've learned about static gradients and adding a whole new layer of dynamism.
Okay, I can already picture those like mesmerizing loading screens
Ugh.
or buttons that subtly shift colors as you hover over them.
The great thing is, Flutter makes it relatively easy to achieve these effects. The built-in animation tools are incredibly powerful.
Okay, we need to dive into this. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a flash to explore the magical world of animated gradients.
So animating gradients, it's like taking everything we know about static gradients
Yeah.
and just like adding this whole new layer of dynamism.
Yeah, I'm ready to jump down this rabbit hole. It sounds like we're moving from like subtle design choices to full-blown visual magic.
It's a great way to put it. Imagine a button, right?
Wow.
And it doesn't just have a gradient. The gradient itself is shifting and morphing as you hover over it.
Hmm.
Or think about like a background that suddenly cycles through these different color blends, creating an almost ethereal mood.
I can kind of picture it now. It's like those animated wallpapers you see, but instead of just changing images, it's the colors themselves that are like flowing and evolving.
And the beauty of Flutter is that it gives you the tools to make these ideas reality. You can animate practically any aspect of a gradient, the colors, the position, even the angle of the blend.
Okay, that's where I get lost. I can imagine the visual effect. But how does it actually work? Is it like super complex coding voodoo?
It's really not as complicated as you might think. Flutter uses this concept called implicit animation. And you essentially just define the start and end states of the gradient. And the framework handles that smooth transition between them.
So you're like telling Flutter, okay, I want this gradient to go from blue to purple over like 2 seconds, and it just figures out all the in-between steps to make it happen seamlessly.
Precisely. And you can get even more creative by tying animations to user interactions. Like, imagine a gradient that pulses when you tap a button,
Yeah.
or one that follows the movement of your cursor.
Now that's what I call interactive design. It's not just about looking pretty, it's about creating this like dynamic experience for the user.
Exactly. And again, the possibilities are truly endless. But let's move on to another question from that FAQ that really caught your eye, applying gradients to text.
Oh, yes. How do you even begin to wrap your head around that? It sounds like some kind of graphic design sorcery.
It does sound a bit magical, doesn't it?
Uh,
But it all boils down to this concept called a shader mask. Imagine you have like a sheet of transparent material with a gradient on it, right?
Mm.
And you place that sheet over your text. Now the text appears to have the colors of the gradient, even though it's not actually colored itself.
So you could have words that fade from blue to purple, or even a whole sentence that looks like a rainbow.
You got it.
Yeah.
Of course, readability is key here. You wouldn't want to use a super busy gradient for body text. But for things like headers, logos, or other design elements, it can create a really unique and eye-catching look.
It's like those fancy Instagram posts where the text is like shimmering and changing colors. It's always so impressive, but I never knew how they did it.
Well, now you've got a glimpse behind the curtain. And the cool thing is, these techniques aren't just limited to app development. You can apply these same principles to any visual project you're working on.
So even if I never write a line of Flutter code, understanding gradients can still make me a better designer overall.
Absolutely. It's all about developing that designer's eye, that ability to see the world through the lens of color, composition, and visual storytelling.
This deep dive has been a revelation. I feel like I've gone from knowing nothing about gradients to being able to appreciate their subtle power and even like imagine how to use them creatively.
And that's the whole point, empowering you with knowledge and inspiring you to see the world in new and exciting ways. Remember, gradients are everywhere, from the apps on your phone to the natural world around you. Start paying attention to them. You'll be amazed at how they influence our perceptions and emotions.
I know I will. From now on, I'm going to be analyzing every website, every app, every sunset with a newfound appreciation for the magic of gradients. Thanks for taking us on this incredible journey.
It was my pleasure. And remember, the most important takeaway is to just keep experimenting and exploring. There's always more to learn and discover in the world of design. And gradients are just one tool in your ever-expanding creative toolbox.